Some of you remember that in 2017 we were celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, and Jan and I had the privilege to go to Wittenberg, Germany, which was the heart and soul of the Reformation 500 years ago, and I got the chance to serve as a pastor, a chaplain, for a couple weeks doing English-speaking services there. And when we were flying home, we had a couple extra days, so we stopped over in London, one of my favorite cities, and it was a beautiful, cold October day, just the way I like it when I'm in London, and it was time for a hot chocolate. So I went to Starbucks, and I walked into Starbucks and immediately noticed two things. Number one, I raised the average age by 30 years. And number two, every single person in that Starbucks, and this is no exaggeration, every single person in that Starbucks was on a screen. Even those who were with friends or in a group of workers. Everyone was on a screen. Now, as we began to talk about last week, screens, generally speaking, and social media specifically, have revolutionized or at least changed the way we think about relationships, and in many ways, in good ways. We have access to people that we never had access to before this digital world. I've been able to connect with friends that I lost contact with years and years ago, but through Facebook we found each other and we've rekindled our friendships with each other. We have access to people in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, and not only do we have access, but we have instant access. You can go onto Facebook right now, you can check Instagram right now, and many of your friends have posted right now what they're doing with their lives. And right now, you could tell people what you're doing. You're sitting in church listening to this fabulous sermon. Or you could take a picture of the breakfast that you had and you could post it. You could tell that heartwarming story about your doggie that happened today. You can instantly tell people what you are doing with your life. Instagram, Facebook have revolutionized the way that we think about relationships. And it seems like this new social media is the next logical step in our evolution as social beings. We know that our DNA is hardwired with the need for relationships. That relationships with other people make us healthier and happier. So it stands to reason that if we can make more connections, we're going to be happier and healthier. 51% of those surveyed in Australia said that their social media contacts are just as valuable and meaningful to them as their face-to-face connections. Social media is revolutionizing the way we think about family and the way that we think about friendships, as seen by this graph that Diane is going to put up on the screen of our basic human needs and how they changed over the years. Now, there are a lot of positive things that we can say about social media, and we talked about many of them last week. But we've been in the social media world now for about 15 years. And we now have some research that tells us that while social media can be really helpful in reconnecting with people, that there are some challenges to them that we need to be aware of as we continue to move into this brave new world. And so what I'd like to do is take a couple minutes with you and look at 7 research-based, what I call sound bites at this point, research-based sound bites of things we need to be aware of in a social media world, particularly those of us who take our faith seriously, and those of us who take our humanity seriously. So here's some challenges to social media. Number one, less face time and more screen time is actually making us more antisocial. We have become more vitriolic. We have become more mean-spirited. And the reason for that is because what social media does is it obliterates all boundaries of human decency and human interaction. We hide behind our screens, and now we feel like we can say anything. And the more we say, the meaner we seem to be getting. And so while there are a lot of good things to say about social media, it's actually making us more anti-social. Secondly, social media tends to show only the best side of ourselves. So when we're posting, we're only going to give the best of our lives. We're going to tweak our selfie picture so we look a whole lot better. And what that means is when we're doing social media interaction, we're not getting the whole story. We're not getting the full human story. Social media is not fully human. Thirdly, and this seems counterintuitive, social media has actually made us lonelier. Now, there are a couple reasons for that. Number one, we're spending so much time on the screen that we're not interacting face-to-face with people. And number two, when we do go on the screen to interact, we see all these brilliantly beautiful lives being lived, and our life doesn't measure up to that, and it just makes us feel terrible about ourselves. In 2000, 4 years before Facebook came out, in the year 2000, the average person had 10 close friends. By 2014, 10 years after Facebook, the average person has 2 close friends. Social media is making us lonelier, not healthier. Number 4, 93% of all communication is nonverbal. And so when we communicate via text or email or on social media, we are missing 93% of the communication, and we set ourselves up for all sorts of miscommunication and misinterpretation. When you get that tweet, when you get that text, when you do that social media post, you don't have that nuance of emotion. You don't have the nuance of body language. And so we're constantly misinterpreting what we say to each other. And we've all had that. You've received that text or that email, you've seen that social media post, and you're thinking to yourself, what is that person thinking? And they're not thinking what you're thinking at all because you missed 93% of the human spirit behind their interaction. Number 5, and we're going to come back to this one next week in particular. Children learn language, they learn emotions and how to manage emotions through face-to-face interactions. And so if children are being raised with parents whose faces are in the screens all the time, or if children have their faces in the screens all the time, they become developmentally behind when it comes to language and when it comes to handling their emotions. I was meeting for lunch the other day with my friend David Murrow. He's written a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church. He's just been commissioned to write a new book on screen time in the digital world. And he shared with me a really interesting insight about social media and language development. And he said, for the most part, we think about this new technological world speeding up the pace of life, which is done. But it has also slowed down the pace of communication. Because when we're talking face-to-face, you have a second or a millisecond to respond to someone's comment to you, right? It's just ongoing. When you send a text and receive a text, you can take a minute to 2 minutes to 10 days to respond to that text. And so you are thinking about your response. And what is happening for people who continually use only text and email or social media to communicate is that when it comes to face-to-face conversation, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to talk in the moment. So for all the positives of social media, language development is becoming a real challenge for us, increasingly for our younger generations, and we'll get back to that next week. Number 6, there is a primal need that all human beings have for touch, and it cannot be met through social media. In the 21st century, we are spending more time touching our phones than we are touching each other. And of course, when I'm talking about touch, I'm talking about appropriate touch, right? We aren't shaking hands like we used to. We aren't hugging people like we used to. We aren't patting people on the back like we used to. We are touching our screens more than we are touching human beings. And to thrive in life, we need human touch. We know, for example, that human touch stimulates the vagus nerve in our body, and the vagus nerve has branches throughout the entire body. And when we're touched, the vagus nerve slows down the nervous system, which slows down your heart rate, which lowers your blood pressure, and lowers your stress. When we're touched, it lessens pain. When we're touched, it releases feel-good hormones like oxytocin. We need human touch, and what social media is doing is robbing us of that very primal need that we have to touch each other in appropriate ways to give life and hope and healing. And then number 7, and we talked about this last week, we're spending so much time trying to capture for social media our human interactions that we're missing the actual human interaction. So again, this is all research-based. This isn't an old guy saying we've got to stop using social media. This is an old guy who's looking at the research that says social media is great, but it can rob us of our humanity if we're not careful. And that's why it's important for us to learn how to manage our social media rather than it managing us. But here's the big takeaway about social media. Social media is tapping into this deep primal need that we have for human interaction. That's really what it's about. It's that cry that we have to connect with other people. And that is a primal need that traces itself back all the way to that first story we looked at last week, the story of Adam and Eve. So when God created Adam, God noticed immediately that Adam was lonely. Now, Adam had the best man cave that you could ever imagine. The Garden of Eden. Big screen TVs. He's got the remote control to himself. He's got who knows how many pet dogs running around. But he was still lonely. And so God looked at that and he said, it's not good for a man to be alone. And God wasn't speaking just about Adam. He wasn't speaking just about men. God was saying it's not good for women to be alone. It's not good for people to be alone. And so God created not a screen, not a social media platform. He created a touchable, face-to-face human being to meet the need for loneliness. And so what that means for us in the 21st century, particularly those of us who are being raised on social media, is that we need to learn to put the human back into our human interactions. One of the things for us as families then is to spend at least an hour a day without a screen. A study was done, and it said that even if the cell phone or an iPad is sitting on the table and nobody is using it, it distracts everyone. It creates boredom and disconnect, just having the screen on the table. So we need to learn how, as families, to have time together without a screen anywhere nearby. We need to have the courage to reach out to coworkers and friends and say, let's sit down for 15, 20 minutes, or let's spend an hour together, and let's just cry together and talk together and pray together and laugh together and put the screens away. And so for many of us, it's going to mean getting in touch once again with our own humanity. To be comfortable in our human skin, not our screen skin. To be comfortable sharing our lives, not behind a screen where we hide so much, but in the open with people who love us and people that we love. And that's why the gospel is so very, very important in the 21st century. Because the gospel is a very human story. It's a story about a God who wants to touch us physically. It's a story about a God who puts skin on, not for FaceTime, but for face-to-face time. And God became a human being, not an idea, not simply a thought or a force. God became an actual, tangible human being so that God could touch us physically. And so that we could touch God physically. And when God touches us and we touch God, we become fully human. And then we find the courage to be fully human with the people around us. In the 21st century, God still touches us physically. And he does that, of course, when we walk into worship and someone shakes our hand, or when someone pats us on the back, or someone says, I'm praying for you today. God touches us in worship when you go and have prayer, and one of us who's praying for you just puts a hand on your shoulder and prays for you. But for all of us, God touches us today with God's grace, with God's humanizing forgiveness, through a simple little wafer and a tiny little glass of grape juice. God is present physically in communion to make you human once again.